Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight and honor of speaking with Joel today, Joel Carini of The Natural Theologian. His book, The Natural Theologian, is fantastic. I highly suggest it. You can find it on Amazon. There it is, bam, and it's beautiful. Look how beautiful it is. Oh, it's really touching on like what, in my opinion, are some of the most absolutely pressing issues in theology, like the structure of theological thought, how theological thought relates with otherness, problems of language. He does wonderful work on Kipsky and others that I think are really important. What exactly are qualities and character of theological thought, Christian thought? More can be said, but I think these topics are really important. He's been doing wonderful presentations and conversations on questions of a topic that can be called presuppositionalism. And what is that and how that operates and what are the perhaps problems with it, which I am quite sympathetic to, and I no doubt we will get into. But one of the reasons to start is that we got together to talk is Joel has been talking about something called Christian humanism, which is a lovely phrase, but also a phrase some people may hear and go, "What in the world is that? Isn't Christian and humanist opposites? How can you talk about Christian humanism?" And I thought we could just start by me asking Joel, "Hey Joel, what do you mean by Christian humanism? What you getting at?" And thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. Well, I was just reading about you and Cadell last and Christian atheism and conservative communism and these things and the way that some like dialectical label like that makes you think. Well, Christian humanist is one of those. Now, I don't know if it always probably had some of that aspect. What is Athens to do with Jerusalem? Like this has been a long-standing conflict potentially, but there have certainly been other times in the history of Christianity where it was a much more natural combination. For example, I've been digging into the history of the Reformation. The Reformation was part of a humanist movement. Like Erasmus didn't become a Protestant, but Zwingli was just directly inspired by Erasmus. Yeah, Luther against him. Anyway, getting distracted. But there were times where Christian humanism was more natural, like the interest in classical culture, the interest in Christian culture. I think in the 1700s and 1800s of America, it would have been very natural that if you are a Christian scholar, you probably read Greek and Latin and read classical texts. You probably also, in the modern era, don't see, I mean, there's just different facets of it, but the great scientists, humanists, and philosophers of those eras were all, many of them were Christian. So this is where I'm interested to explore some of the history of secularism and all that. But I think towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, this starts to seem like more of an oxymoron. You kind of have secular humanism on the one hand. I think T.H. Huxley maybe took over the word humanism somewhere in there. And Christians, there's more of a retreat to commitment, as one author had it. Whether that's what he was talking about, which is Barth at the highest level of theology on the continent, or American fundamentalism, and then right in between this thing called presuppositionalism that I'm talking about. All of these were sort of a retreat from the common human realm of inquiry, the scientific, the humanities, to Christianity is now going to be sort of, it's going to retreat from the public, common human domain of inquiry to be a subfield for the true believers, which, let's say, when Christianity was culturally hegemonic, that wasn't the case. It was just humans, when they think about religious topics, ask questions about Jesus Christ and God and so on. Whereas now it's like, it's an ideology. It's what a group of true believers, often a corner in private, think. So I know there's like liberalism in the background there, the privatization of religion. But okay, so that brings me to kind of what is Christian humanism like today? Like historically, it was, as Bruce Gordon from Yale told me recently, it was just being interested in classical sources as a Christian. You read the classics, you had your classical education. That's what education was for a long time. But alongside the Bible, with a fruitful tension or constructive dialogue between the two. Um, I think today, humanism has to be more than just classical sources. It has to be broadly an interaction with other perspectives and disciplines, kind of an interdisciplinary building of a worldview. And so for Christians in particular to be humanists, they have to avoid becoming blinkered in the theological disciplines of biblical studies, theology, and similar things, which not all Christians are blinkered in that way, but a great many are. As someone who went through seminary and Christian-specific institutions, there is a tendency to get stuck in a discourse of Christians talking to Christians about Christian things. And so, admittedly, coming out of that, I'm trying to spread the message of sort of how to broaden out and become a thinker who, while doctrinally aligned with a school of thought, let's say, or an actual faith, is their worldview is not insulated from philosophy, in my own academic professional case, or psychology, empirical sciences, sociology, literature, and so on, and life itself.
I think that is very well put. And and also too, I like how you described the difference between a closed system and an open system in Christianity, where most Christian theology is a closed system, meaning here are our base assumptions and axioms. And the thought and the name of the game of theology is to maintain and defend the internal consistency of that system. A phrase I'm obsessed with is an internally consistent system. And what an internally consistent system is, I'll also call a map, because I think a map is distinct from a notion. And obviously, I'm alluding to the book that, from that review, Cadell, the map is indestructible. So when you started talking, all this topic on presuppositionalism, Christian humanism, closed system, open system, I think is massively important. And so that's a major concern of mine. An internally consistent system is a system that entails no essential contradiction, meaning there is nothing internal in it that would unveil it is necessarily wrong. It may be wrong, but you cannot determine it is necessarily wrong. And I think basically what has happened is most theology is in the business of assuring that you have a system of a belief that could possibly be true because it entails no essential contradiction. Now, of course, the Christian would say, well, we don't know for sure it's true, of course, but we also have no reason to think it is wrong equally because it is internally consistent. So it is just as true as anything can be true. And I think that's the key move that has occurred after. I basically think the response to postmodernity, which can be a boogeyman, but if we take it, the critiques of Derrida at his best, or Kurt Gödel, et cetera, so forth, it's basically the idea that we cannot determine correspondence. We cannot have certainty. We cannot know what truths are axiomatically necessarily true, right? Okay, well, if that's off the table, the best we can do is internal consistency, coherence. Well, theology has spilled a whole lot of ink to find a coherent model of Christianity. And I'm not saying that necessarily has no value. It clearly has a lot of value because it is able to effectively then organize behavior, institutions, community, because you can show there is no essential contradiction and therefore it could correspond even if we can't know for sure because certainty is impossible. Oh, and by the way, no ideology, no worldview, atheism, Islam, Hinduism, it doesn't matter, no worldview can achieve certainty and correspondence after Gödel. Therefore, it's just as true as anything could possibly be, so leave us alone. And basically, that creates, but now I would make the argument that that's basically what every worldview has done. Every worldview has gone into the business of creating internal consistency with itself, and everyone now is in this business of getting people to accept their presuppositions. And if you don't, well, you're outside the presupposition, and that's why you don't believe it, because you're outside our internally consistent system. And Christianity has a map, so I'm going to use the term map and internally consistent system interchangeably. Christianity has a map, atheism has a map, communism has a map, capitalism has a map. We are in an age that has, through almost a kind of natural selection, removed most notions, and most worldviews that have a seat at the table are internally consistent. Now, that's a giant claim. I would have to justify it. But most voices you're going to hear on the media are going to be from a worldview that is a map. Well, how then does democracy move forward if the only way it moves forward is people change their presuppositions, which the whole idea of how they have coherence is not to do so? So basically, democracy's over, discussion is over, the ability of actually between spaces in worldviews is over. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to point this out in Christianity is because if Christianity, let me put it this way, if Christianity is supposed to be in the world but not of it, but it's just another internally consistent system, then it's in the world and of it, because that's what everyone is doing now. So presuppositionalism is actually just a mirror reflection of what basically we're seeing the world of global pluralism fall into a bunch of internally consistent maps trying to convince one another to join their presuppositions. Oh, and by the way, politically, this will look like violence or fascism or a breaking off of everyone into small fascist states. And if Christians want to be in the world and not of it, they must hold themselves in a mode of discourse that is not reflecting the global discourse of presuppositional competition. And so to me, this is extremely important, and thus recovering the humanism, the tradition, and it is very interesting because, like you said, this is so important. We may hear humanism and think it's new. We may think the idea of bringing in classical sources or interdisciplinary thinking is new. No, no, it's pretty old. It was done for a while. What was the phrase they would use? I can't remember who said it. It was this idea of baptizing the classics. There was this idea, this notion of
Yeah.
baptizing many sort of different disciplines. I think that is so true. And that would be alternative to the game of indestructible maps going on. But I'll pause and throw it to you on any comment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's forces like tribalism and ideology taking. I was just thinking a bit sociologically this morning about Christian Smith and something he argues about American evangelicals, that some of their, he argues in his book about them that like they are a very strong subculture. I'm gonna have to say we. I definitely count sociologically. I'm resisting, some of these facets, but some of the things that we care about most strongly, for example, like telling other people about our faith, are some of the things that are most off-putting to outsiders. Well, what does this mean? Sociologically, this is kind of a virtue signal to our group, actually, or to ourselves sometimes, to show that we are, you know, righteous by our own standards. And that's how you kind of create a strong in-group. And he grants very strong in-group. Evangelicals are more consistent with their beliefs sociologically than other religious groups. Not all of them, but many of them. So if you recognize that a lot of the function of our discourse is doing that, well, that's contrary to our own stated aims. The stated aim of an evangelical Christian is to speak to those beyond their circle. Now, frequently it's the goal is to have a one-sided conversation beyond their circle, which isn't really a conversation. It's to sort of project the message. But I think just from that point alone, you can start to get the critique that I'm bringing, which is, well, how do you speak beyond your own circle? Well, all of a sudden you have to kind of drop your own internal lingo. We sometimes call it Christianese. You have to start using words that everybody else uses and show that the concepts you're talking about are the same concepts other people are talking about, with a few exceptions of the truly distinctive things. And then if you're going to do that, well, all of a sudden you actually have to understand the human world. And then academically, intellectually, the other disciplines of human life, like psychology and philosophy and sociology. And all of a sudden, you're just not doing the thing you were doing before. You're doing many more things. You're no longer just engaged in projecting your gospel to the world, but to understanding the world on its own terms. And obviously, this applies to people of any ideology, because it's not that you give up all belief, but both to communicate it to others and to test for yourself and for others whether it's really true. You need this kind of dialogical relationship to outside perspectives, outside disciplines. So yeah, those are some initial thoughts on what you're saying.
I think it is so important. Well, there's an argument for me that you don't even think unless you think the problem that the map is not the territory. And the issue is presuppositionalism seems, here's the key, it seems to take seriously the map is not the territory because it says we can't know the territory, all we have is the map. But it does so in a manner that the distinction between map and territory is practically inconsequential. Real thinking always maintains the fact that the map is not at the territory, at the center of its thought, which of course is begging madness because it's really hard to maintain that. But that is what you actually have to maintain. I call that the Gödel point, referencing Kurt Gödel,
Mm.
that point where it is unveiled that correspondence does not equal coherence. Now, I'd have to go into detail at that, but for our purposes here, it is basically the memory that the map is not the territory. And we all need to reside in our own Gödel point relative to our own first principles. Because here's another key point. We do have to have a view from somewhere, as Nagel put it. So this is not saying destroy map. You could argue that the response to modernity of destroying ideology was a giant mistake because you cannot do that. Humans require given. They require an ideological structure, givens. I'll also talk about how I believe, in belonging again, we talk about the loss of givens, the thoughtless kind of way of organizing society. Maps are filling in the loss of givens. Presuppositionalism is a way to address the change of the sociological order from one where, say, you're born into Christianity and the world just is Christian. You never question it. You never think about it. Well, after modernity, you know that Christianity is just an option among many. Well, how are you going to return to something like givenness now that you can think about it? Well, you create an internally consistent system. And in a way, maps are stronger than internally consistent systems because you can think about them all you like. Maps are stronger than givens. I'm sorry. Internally consistent systems are stronger than givens because you can think about them all you like and they have an answer. They can maintain their consistency. All you have to do is assume their principles. So there's a real sense in which maps are a kind of evolution to givens. It's a kind of address, right? Now, there
Mm.
are trade-offs. I do think it isn't as effective of creating existential stability because you're doing it in light of a global pluralism that's always making you question it, but it's better than nothing. And it probably seemingly, in my opinion, is more likely to create extremism because you have to really buckle down. Where with
Yeah.
Gibbons, it's almost an innocence. Oh, I've just never met people different. It's more innocent. There's something about maps that tends to breed more fieriness, more intensity. But that's what you see
Yeah.
with presuppositional Christians, right? You see this intensity. Joel, please.
Yeah. So maps are they're an attempt to recreate givens, but I think in the realm of like consciousness and intentionality.
Yes.
Um, and as a result, they're actually much more insecure.
Yeah.
So I recently wrote about J. Gresham Machen, a major figure in the liberalism modernism controversy in the American Protestant churches. And he was studying abroad with the German liberal biblical scholars. In one letter, his mother expressed concern. He pushed back in this letter, uh, saying that mother's mistake is the old mistake of the Orthodox. To examine only one side of the perspective, like one perspective, is to admit that you think the other is potentially true. Like if you're unwilling to hear the counter evidence, the flip side, you're granting a kind of deep insecurity about your own position. And so, yeah, just to get to this notion of presuppositionalism, it's a specific, a concentrated form of what we're talking about, which I think you can find the general attitude much more broadly.
Mm.
Like the idea that, for example, Christians will only read Christian books, or I just heard of D.L. Moody, the evangelist. He was a man of one book. Well, that's actually kind of there might be a fault to that. Um, and so presuppositional, it wasn't influenced by like British idealism, and therefore it's kind of rationalistic in its perspective. Like a British rationalistic version of Hegel, if you will. It's just like, we're going to start from inside our own brains, first principles, logic out everything. Hey, we're good.
Yeah.
Um, there's the idea that truth was a whole. And so uh, what that led to is sort of ideas all come in big package deals. You
Right.
can't learn a piece here and there from different perspectives. You got your materialist atheism here, you've got your kind of idealist pantheism here, and you've got Christian theism, and it's totally unique and distinctive, which is not what Christians claimed in times past. At least main chunks of the Christian tradition said, hey, we can align with Platonism on all sorts of stuff, or with Aristotelianism, or with modern philosophy. So what it ends up being is, yes, we're not going to accept anything that doesn't start from the perspective we already inhabit. You kind of dig in your heels. And it has like a couple of different slogans, like there is no common ground between believers and unbelievers. Okay, you can swap in any ideological camps there. Like there's no common ground between right wingers and left wingers, or between communists and capitalists. And you start to get the picture of someone who's unwilling to have a conversation with the other side, which what you end up with, I often also speak about coherence, like coherentism
Yeah.
in analytic philosophy, the term for kind of a self-enclosed circle of beliefs. And this figure, Cornelius Van Til, would argue that at the end of the day, our argument for Christianity is a circular argument, and there's nothing else you can do about it, which is a very kind of direct avowal. I mean, it's had other defenders. Barth,
Yeah.
Plantinga, in his own way, had
In his own way.
Reformed epistemology is still pretty influential, and it's this kind of way of saying we're not going to do the whole apologetics and like defending the worldview kind of thing. We're going to just plea almost for a place at the table. Like, you've got your perspective, we got our perspective, give us a place at the table, with some added theology about, the Holy Spirit flipped a switch in our brain so all our beliefs are justified. A position analytic philosophers would call justification and externalism, which
I
has the downside that you have no idea how your beliefs are justified. You're just like, I think something happened there up in the brain machinery,
right.
which was part of Descartes' skepticism. He's like, I think the pineal gland is doing it.
Right.
Well, the 20th century Christians are like, I think the Holy Spirit's doing it.
Yeah.
We're getting hooked
Yeah.
up to the world somehow. But I think you're right. Like, is there a possibility of objective consideration of the world, of checking correspondence? And it is challenging. I mean, as other philosophers said, you can't get a view from sideways on. Like, get your head and the world in view and just check, is my map mapping onto the world? No, because you're always in your own head. And so, yeah, deep epistemological questions about whether our mind is open to the world, whether the world is being revealed or manifested to us in any way, or if we're kind of behind a veil of impressions,
Yeah.
these arise. And so through contemplating this presuppositionalism, I've had to dig into all of those.
Yeah. No, I brilliantly put, and there's so many important things here. So I do think you are correct. A lot of, as I understand Till and that realm of thinking, it does seem to be British, a lot of that British idealism and this emphasis on holism, that you have to know all the wholes to know the parts. There's a few assumptions I would question. First off, that seems to say you can only know something if you can have certainty. And the only way to get certainty is to know the whole. And if you don't know the whole, you can't have certainty, therefore you can't know, right? Well, I like to say you can't have certainty about anything, but you can't have confidence. I'm not certain that that when I walk outside, I'm going to be able to go downstairs, but I can have confidence that I can make it in different things. Oh, and there's also an assumption, now this would take us off course, is that something like a Gestalt theory that a James Wigley or other people of reality would argue is not true, which is the idea that reality is a Gestalt and every part actually contains the information of the whole. So even if you only can know a part, that actually will isomorphically give you the structure of the whole, right? And there is a metaphysical assumption of the division between parts and whole in holism that may or may not be the case, right? And so, that's very important. So I don't think it's the case that you require certainty to have true knowledge, because you can have confidence. And that is enough to make, because the question would become, what even is knowledge? There's a way in which actually, in my opinion, some people conflate the words knowledge and certainty. Knowledge is certainty. Well, that assumes certainty exists, and that description of knowledge is what makes something knowledgeable, right? I think this would be a whole lot. We're defining knowledge then by things, not action and patterns and relations. And if reality is actually more so time than space and unfolding, then just because I can't know what a thing is, I can have a sense of the unfolding of patterns. Yeah, so there's kind of in the holism like this idea of certainty. I can't have certainty about time. I don't know where time is going, right? But that doesn't mean I can't have confidence about time because there's an unfolding pattern, right? So there's a whole lot here, but I always feel the holism assumes space over time. It assumes certainty as the only way to have knowledge, and it actually conflates knowledge and certainty when knowledge could actually be more the apprehension of pattern, right? Knowing you see a pattern and you have a pretty good sense of how those things will unfold. And certainly, even if we can't have certainty, we can have enough of a sense of things to reliably carry out action in the world. We're not always right, but we can create reliability and we do it all the time. And then the question becomes the following. What is the value add of moving from confidence to certainty? Like, what is going to be gained in certainty that is not gained in practicality, right? I can't think of anything. And in fact, all I can actually do is think of certainty as a certain temptation. And actually, I think it's the temptation of presuppositionalism. Because the only way to get something that really feels like certainty is to basically throw off the problem of correspondence and say you can't have correspondence. All you can have is coherence. And therefore, coherence is practically as much of certainty as you can get. Therefore, if you get it, you have practical certainty, even a technical certainty, and that's enough to speak as if you have certainty. And so certainty tempts one toward an exclusionary way of being. Whereas I like confidence, and also the great Lesby Newbegin emphasized confidence in his book, Proper Competence, and he was an evangelist, and he was in India, and so on and so forth. He actually argues the quest for certainty leads to nihilism, and I actually agree with this. I think it leads to nihilism or presuppositionalism. It leads to maps, one or the other. And confidence also forces you to be open to the other. It is fundamentally a humanist stance, though, because the only way to be confident and believe you can be held is that there's a common ground holding you that you don't have to be certain in. Because why do you need certainty? The belief that there is no common ground leads to a need for certainty. But if you believe in a common ground, well, I don't need certainty. I just need confidence because we're all upheld by this thing. This thing is constant. There's something about, and I'll throw it for you for any response, although I have a million more things to say because this is so important, on the problem of correspondence. But for me, it is not by chance that the throwing out of common ground leads to the hunger for certainty. Because certainty is a kind of analytical mental version of a ground, right? And if you can't get an objective ground after Kurt Gödel per se, like a axiomatic ground, then the ground is going to be in terms of presuppositions. And that's where people go. But the need for certainty goes away if you have a common ground. In fact, certainty is boring. Confidence is exciting because there's mystery, there's exploration, there's a reason to be open to the other, there's incentive to explore. Confidence gives you a stable ground by which to explore mystery. Certainty means there's nothing to do. Certainty is boredom. And what did Benjamin Fontaine tell us happens in boredom? War, violence, sexual problems, all sort of stuff, right? So certainty leads to a condition where there's nothing to do, which humans don't tend to do well when there's nothing to do. And actually that creates all sorts of social problems. So let me throw it at you, Joel.
Gathering some thoughts here about empiricism, because one of the places I can kind of hook on here is you've critiqued a certain kind of rationality. Part of what I'm getting to is a preference for empiricism over rationalism.
Yes.
And there's also how it theologically resonates. So for example, I used to think that the presuppositionalism was more kind of the humble mode of epistemology, essentially, to just it's almost kind of self-abasement epistemologically. Like, my brain doesn't work. Give me the answers from on high, O Lord. And now I shall remove my brain and my autonomous rationality and insert a Bible. And the Bible shall be the workings of my mind. And sometime in my year at U of C, U of Chicago, I was digging into the logical positivists and these kind of early 20th century scientific atheist philosophers. And I just happened upon this thought, and of all places, A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, which, was the God delusion of a previous era,
Yeah.
uh, where he basically he basically suggested that being an empiricist was an acknowledgement of the finitude of the human mind.
Hmm.
That whether God exists or not, our mode of cognition is not that which God would have. And then this started to show up through the curriculum eventually in my course on Kant with James Conant. I've told you about his essay, Why Kant
Yes.
is Not a Kantian. But one of the pieces of this is that Kant is always thinking about epistemology, human epistemology, kind of with often the distance is this alternative to human epistemology, which is divine epistemology. Whether real or hypothetical, it's just a limited concept or whatever. The idea being, some of these things we're talking about, like holism and certainty, would obviously be true for an infinite knower.
Right. Yeah.
Because the infinite knower, first of all, another piece was the division between theoretical and practical reason, which is the very source of the division between his first two volumes.
Yes.
Okay, well, for God, theoretical reason just is the same as practical
Yeah.
reason. God knows how the circulatory system of a platypus works by practical reason, the same way I know I'm going to pick up this cup. I didn't have to observe it. He made the platypus and its circulatory system. So there's no like having to receive it from the outside, take it
Yeah.
in, and use induction and so forth. For human beings, our mode of cognition is, in contrast to God's pure spontaneity or activity of his intellect, ours is largely receptive.
Right.
And there's some active, everyone talks about Kant, with Kant, like the active work of the intellect in shaping experience. And it's like, well, actually a major part of what he got inspired by Hume was that our intellect is largely receptive.
Hmm.
And so this is part of the source of what I accept is that Kant is actually a bit more of a neo-scholastic. Like, this sounds a heck of a lot like Aquinas and Aristotle.
Hmm.
The reception through the senses, and then there's the active intellect ordering some of this, but all the content is coming from experience. Without percepts, our concepts are empty. That's Aristotle. That is a dictum of ancient empiricism, which I'm trying to defend in my dissertation in a certain way. So what that means is that everything we've been talking about of like givens, and then the replacement for givens being maps, which are these, which start maybe from axiomatic premises. Gödel, talk about mathematics. So many philosophers have tried to model their philosophy on mathematics to try to start from, perfectly sound propositions that we can then move forward from there. And then theologians have tried to do the same thing. Like, a lot of the way traditional systematic theology is laid out is as deduction from premises. If there's any induction, it's the induction from the Bible verses. And then, so all of the Bible verses are taken as axiomatic. But back to rationalism and empiricism just isn't that way. Crucially, something I want to write about more is, I think so much of what we think of as, I've had this article on the back burner for over a year. So much of what we think of as logic or rationality is sort of like, well, if A, then you would think that B, logically. And it's like, yeah, you would think, but you'd be wrong. Like, empirical reality has no need to correspond to your prejudgment or what you thought intuitively. Um, and I think that's when we learn, is when we find out that though we thought B followed from A, not B is actually the case. And so A and not B can be true together. Sometimes, it's worse, and we think that it's A and not A, and we're like, wow, there's There's two sides.
I strongly agree with this. So for me, a lot of the way we deal with the problem of internally consistent systems is in fact in the encounter of maps. It's when people encounter one another and they pay attention to what happens. Um, so um, so sure, you can always wonder if what you think is true, but there's something about, let's say, a surprise. A surprise is that moment when you don't doubt there's an external world because you're
Yeah.
surprised. The definition of surprise confirms there's actuality, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be surprised, right? When somebody in conversation, and I know conversation is huge for overturning presuppositional thought. I think you emphasize that, and it's very true. Like the Bible assumes you know what a donkey is. Well, where do you get that data, right? And in conversation, it's only possible because we can have intelligence across presuppositions, across maps, right? Like the entire act of
Mhm.
communication is proof that intelligibility is possible between systems and outside of presuppositional assumptions, that we can have shared knowledge because we can talk. And so language is really, really important. Now, we may mishear one another, we may misunderstand, but misunderstanding is always evidence of common ground. You can't misunderstand something unless there was a shared thing that you're misunderstanding. Error is evidence of actuality. This is where someone like Hegel is like the fear of error is the fear of truth, right? So spaces of misunderstanding are spaces of actuality. It's just that we don't what we're saying when we say when the Christian says there's no possibility of shared agreement, shared space with the atheist. Well, there's an idea that we don't agree, so we can't have a shared space, right? You can have a shared space and disagree. In fact, there would not be a shared space if there wasn't shared intelligibility to disagree upon, right? So there is some shared intelligibility. It's just that people are interpreting it in different ways. But again, that requires some shared something, right? So when you have surprise, when you engage in conversation, when you engage in changing your view to account for something new you experience, all of this suggests that there is something outside of presuppositions, that there is some actuality that you are working your presuppositions to entail, right? One of the reasons why, so for me, I like to talk about, a bit inspired by Hegel, differences between presuppositions and intersuppositions. And what I mean by that is a presupposition or these prejudgments or kind of axioms. The intersuppositional is in the encounter. It is the truth
Mhm.
or the ideas that emerge enter in the inter-between space, in the metaxis, as a William
Mhm.
Desmond will talk about, right? And one of the dangers of presuppositional thought is it removes incentive to encounter otherness, to engage in a dialogue where both parties are looking to see what emerges between them that is kind of unexpected. And you mentioned Cadell's article. Well, this is the idea that when you put Christianity and atheism together, new thought comes out. Communism and conservative together, new thought comes out. And that's because the thought, here's the issue. This thought that emerges has a certain quality of surprise to it that suggests a actuality to it that actually can help you, one, think new thoughts, and also to realize, oh, there is something outside of my presuppositions. Because these thoughts that can emerge are things that I wasn't able to think on my own, but then when I experience them, they have a certain authority to them. Like, it's that weird, there's this weird move, because you were mentioning God in this sort of, for me, I'd use the language, God just apprehends. What he apprehension brings together in God, theological and practical knowledge all at the same time. Whereas human beings, there's a difference. It's very hard for us to apprehend. However, it seems as if we have certain degrees of apprehension because when you're listening to someone, there's eventually, oh, aha, oh, I get it. You suddenly apprehend something. Your brain is not actively calculating or necessarily following everything bit by bit. You're listening. It's more of a kind of receiving structure, right? You're receiving, and then in that receptibility, you go, aha, yes, boom. There's an apprehension that emerges, right? That apprehension, I think, is at the heart of human beings having new ideas, developing their thought, and even developing their humanity. But here's the issue. I think apprehension as such is primarily developed between maps in metaxis spaces, not within maps. But if you have a
Ah,
theology that makes you not need to encounter otherness or encounter the world, Because I guess the other like so I use all different neologisms, which is good and bad and blah blah blah. But another one is I think we need encounterology. Like it's a philosophy based on the encounter act, which is also, of course, I'll talk about phenomenology. You're talking about empiricism. I always think there's like this phenomenological experience, but it's not just asking the question, what are the conditions of possibility for me to be experiencing the bookcase as I am, brown with certain shapes? Phenomenology wants to get into the conditions of reality that make certain experiences possible. You're asking about that in the encounter of the other person. When I encounter the atheist, and my brain goes XY direction, and I'm actually able to share intelligibility and have ideas I haven't had before, what must the conditions of reality be like in order to make that possible? Oh, and God made the conditions of reality, so it seems as if God made a world where intelligibility is possible across different worldviews. And also, it would seem as if God has made a reality where the encounter of difference leads to new ideas and new thoughts that were never there before, almost as if a certain blessing of the openness to the other, almost as if there's a certain like reward and a certain grace that comes from it. Right? So there's a lot more to be said, but this idea of empiricism, and I'll give it to you, the encounter, before I forget, I don't need, this is what's so important. Presuppositions is a term of thought. I do not need presuppositions to hear a bird sing. Like experience does not need presuppositions. The interpretation of the experience brings into the presupposition. But experience itself comes forth on its own terms. And then we tend to absorb them into our presuppositions. If we became better receivers of experience, then this is a different quality of thought. And this is for me dealing with this problem of not being able to get behind your coherence. No, you can't ever get outside your coherence, but you can make your coherence bang against other coherences. You can make your coherence come to between spaces, and that having glimmers and glimpses of something beyond your coherence that immediately is then absorbed into it. But you have these moments, these glimpses and glimmers. I'm obsessed with glimpses and glimmers in philosophy. There are these moments in the between space where something comes forth. Oh, and if you saw it once, then reality must be a place where it's possible, and therefore you can theorize it. Philosophers should not only be in the business, theologians and philosophers should not only be in the business of thinking things they can see non-contingently at any moment of any day. We should think the glimmers and glimpses, the things that are conditional, the way thought acts when it encounters otherness, the way it behaves in like a hip-hop cipher, the way it behaves in the artistic act, because these are revelations of thought that operate in terms of surprise and relation, not just presupposition, and we need to think the encounter, think the surprise, think the metaxis, think the intersuppositional, because that is where you see it is possible to think beyond presuppositions, not because you deconstruct presuppositions and get beyond. It's more like this. You see something beyond presupposition that you bring back to your presuppositions and change their quality. That's the activity for me of maps. Maps are indestructible. You can never get beyond them, but you can have experiences that you bring back to the internal consistency to change their quality. The internal consistency can change. It can transform because you're bringing in new experiences that it has to account for, and it then has to be reworked. So internal consistency does not have to be stagnant. It doesn't have to be unchanging. It can develop, it can unfold in a Hegelian sense, right? Well, here's the issue. There's only one way, though, it's going to unfold, and then I'll give it to you. It's going to have to be in the encounter of the other. Because the whole idea of your Christian presupposition is you're finished. It's stagnant. It's done. All you need to do is defend the crystalline structure, right? If there is the possibility of a new experience that you can add to your consistency and have it unfold in a new way, almost by definition, it's going to be outside of the structure of the presuppositions that are existing. Therefore, the Christian will be from the atheist that will provide the way to make the map unfold. Therefore, by definition, for the atheist, it will be from the Christian, etc., so forth. So the only way to make presuppositions unfold is by placing some sort of premium on experience, then the system, not the system over the experience. And for me, though, that so much comes in the encounter, the surprise, but then, of course, we have to be the kind of people who can handle surprise, who can handle otherness, who can handle difference. And I can't help but see constantly modeled in Jesus a person who's... What's the point of Jesus's ethics seeming? Like the Sermon on the Mount seems... All of the all of the stuff that Jesus is teaching sure does seem to have something to do with being able to handle the encounter with otherness. Why would he care so much about it if we're just going to have crystalline structures that basically removes the need for those sort of skills? And in that way, we see ethics and epistemology tied together. That's what I think is so important. Ethics opens up conditions of possibility of thinking. It's not ethics are over here, epistemology is over here. If you have the ethics to handle the other, you will be able to employ methods of thinking that otherwise you won't be able to employ. So ethics increase conditions of possibility for thinking. But we remove all of that if all we have is presuppositions. What ends up happening, I'll stop. It's such a big topic. Is that if we don't think this, the point of ethics is to show your participation in your presuppositions. It's to show your map. It's to represent your map. Like the point of ethics become, well, I'm a Christian, and then I have these presuppositions because I act this way, right? But it's not the idea that ethics opens up possibility of thought. That's not what we think ethics is about. In my opinion, ethics opens possibility of thought. Because if you can be slow to anger, you can be patient, you can be meek, then you can encounter the other and not try to kill them and therefore be transformed by them, not in a manner that makes you betray Christianity, but that makes the seed blossom. And so ethics and epistemology are just strongly tied together. But I will stop and give it back to you.
Hey, it's great stuff. Okay, two parts I want to talk about. I want to get to the encounterology in a second because I'm trying to embody that in my own studies with an agnostic professor, let's say.
Yeah.
But first, with the maps thing, like I think there's a lot of encounter with reality that bypasses our conscious maps. And it's not that it has no map. Like I think it has the stuff that like Peterson and who's that other psychologist, the master and commander, two halves of the brain guy. Like
Oh,
these
McGilchrist.
folks
Yeah.
talk about Gilchrist.
Yeah.
These folks talk about how our experience of the world is always mediated by a very kind of deep psychology of just like object permanence and trying to unify experience. This is more the stuff Kant talked about. That stuff's that psychology and kind of Kant stuff is very interesting. That's kind of different than conscious ideology in response to the lack of metaphysical, moral, religious givens. That stuff is very conscious. And this is important because with Christians and with the presuppositionalists, they'll try to say that like all evidence of the outside world comes through our goggles of Christian worldview. And so we all see different stuff. And I'm like, I've heard birdsong. The non-Christian over there has heard birdsong. I played in an orchestra with people who were not unified in their metaphysical or religious views. We must have been hearing the same tones. And it's like, yeah, we all were subject to the psychology and like the presuppositions that are like really basic to being human. Yes, like that's true. But our conscious ideologies that we adopt, I think, experience gets through those all the time. That's actually the kind of opening to have our worldview challenged. But sometimes if you push in the direction I'm saying, people accuse you of brute empiricism.
Right.
And so I did write one article where I was like, well, I'm not in favor of like brutish empiricism, like basically where the world hits me in the eyes and I just like automatically know reality. It's like, no, there's a lot of processing and like there's a lot going on here to kind of reconstruct the world as we experience it. But I do think we can have a civilized empiricism.
Yeah.
So like the structure of civilization and let's say the academy of, and this is what brings us to the encounterology, as you're saying, of like, yes, human beings do try to make a coherent whole out of experience. Like this is what Quine said in the mid 20th century. He's like, we all have this big web of belief, and at the outskirts, it's being punched by, inputs from experience all the time, and we're trying to put the pieces together. And he said, nothing in the web of belief, down to the laws of logic, is free of revision. Like experience could throw us for a loop. But one way to acknowledge what we're talking about there is if you want to get at reality, interface with somebody from a different tribe or a different ideological group. And I mean, that is rarer than it should be. I mean, for example, even in the academy, there's a tendency to sort of mono thought where people who do science together also adopt the same religious and political views. You're like, well, there's no correlation there between your scientific work and that. Sometimes they pretend that there is. Um, so for me, for example, I mean, partly through the experience of the kind of presuppositionalism and then the broad-minded University of Chicago, I was like, man, I want to keep studying philosophy with people who don't agree with me, because that's where I'm sure to have to be stretched beyond my own current map. And I got into a Catholic university, so pretty close to what I already believe, let's be honest. Uh, but happily, they employ philosophers of different perspectives. Um, and so I sought out an advisor who is a kind of secular Platonist, if you will. And that's been very productive. So this kind of illustrates it. My search for kind of paper topics with him and dissertation topics were kind of, they exemplified this. Like at first, in a course on Plato, I just noticed the way he had a really secular interpretation of Plato, which is very common. You say that, Plato added the myths at the end of every Socratic dialogue. Socrates was a nice, secular, effective altruist or something back in the day. But, Plato corrupted it. Forget the Neoplatonists and the Christians. Oh my goodness. And so I was sort of focused on like my points of disagreement with him. Like, I want to defend like Plato as a prelude to the gospel and all this stuff. And then I gradually realized as I was searching for a paper topic, like, I'm not going to learn by trying to have a theist atheist debate with this guy.
Yes. Right.
That's not where I'm going to learn and grow from what he has to offer. And so I found what at first I thought was maybe like a minor point of agreement in one of his papers. And I was like, okay, let me go at that. And, 5 years later, here I am still doing the same thing. Like, and the point ultimately was realism philosophically. I could have found a different point of agreement with other people, but I think this one's really illustrative because this is where I come to is like, what is the common ground between believers and unbelievers? Reality. We are in the same world. Um, and I mean, I'm less continental, as they say, but I've heard of like a concept of reality kind of exceeding our concepts, like this overflow, and that's phenomenologically or something. Like that is very much what he and I are trying to get at. He frequently says that like forget about like the propositions or like the actual thing we think is true. The object of our thought, what we're thinking about, is the real object out there with all its properties, known and unknown.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different from the idea that's much more popular, which is that our conceptualization of things limits the object of our thought.
Right.
I am dealing with that thing insofar as I conceptualize it. And honestly, that breaks down because are you dealing with the thing? Like,
Yes.
you're either dealing with a thing or you're not. If it's really just your concept, then that's things intermediate between you and the world. You're really stuck at the level of your concepts. You're at a veil of impressions sometimes. Now it's a veil of concepts. But, you know, what my concept of Daniel Garner is is not limited to whoever matches the description of Daniel Garner in my head. Like, imagine secretly you have a double life. You're a completely different person in reality. Um, my thought was still of you
Yes.
because you are the individual being that it is about. Like, I
Yes.
would correct my concept of you. I wouldn't switch it to some other Virginia
Exactly.
farmer intellectual. if I found out that you were living in double. No, it'd be like Daniel Garner, the very guy, was other than I thought he was.
Yep.
There is reality exceeding my conceptualization.
Yes.
And so what you get here is, I said empiricism is humble. Here, realism is not what sometimes gets called like dogmatic realism, which is sort of my map matches the territory.
Right.
It is the object of my thought is something beyond me. Therefore, I'm accountable to it. And actually, some philosophers have objected to realism because they think it leads to skepticism.
Right.
Like, if you're a realist, then everything you think could be wrong, and that just can't be true. Donald Davidson said this, for instance. Hillary Putnam said something similar at one point. But yes, that is what realism is. Like, if the brain in the vat scenario were reality, then yeah, everything we think would be wrong. Whereas most people think realism is the brain in the vat scenario is not correct. Or G.E. Moore at the beginning of analytic philosophy was, I can prove the external world. Here's a hand. And that's where Wittgenstein's uncertainty gets started from. But yeah, realism is actually the idea that the object of my thought is the real stuff out there, and it can exceed what I currently think.
Well, I love everything you just said. So there's a few things. First, we treat, even if when I look at this bookcase, there are things unknown about it, that is not the same as saying it is unknowable. People conflate unknown and unknowable. Unknown, if I know there are unknown things, then I know real knowledge. There are unknown things about it, and now it's an invitation to relate to it and to explore it, right? Just because I have mental constructs, sure, may get in the way of getting at what the thing is to itself, but I know that. I know that. And that's real knowledge that I can act on. That doesn't make it unknowable. That tells me how to relate to it in a real way. So the problem is people take the phrase, I can't get to the thing in of itself, as a primarily knowledge, but it's a term of how to relate to it. So that and that's real. So I can never know a person fully. So I better commit to them and have more conversations with them and have a lifetime with them, right? The knowledge that I can't know a person fully is not, well, what's the point? It's a mode of orientation. And I think problematically, people have taken the impossibility of, quote unquote, getting to the thing itself as not a mode of orientation. And it's a mode of orientation by which you get real knowledge. Because what it is saying, in my opinion, is real knowledge follows from a continual process. A continual act of relating to learn more, right? So real knowledge is ever learning. But people say, well, if it's ever learning, you don't learn. No, no, no. You make real steps along the way. Just because it's continual does not mean the steps are not real until you get to the end, right? So the fact that things are unknown, quote unquote, you can even put the UN in parentheses. Everything is an unknown per se, a mixture of the unknown and the unknown. You know that. You have real knowledge that everything is unknown, and if you have a mode of orientation to it, you know the orientation needed by which to get real knowledge, which is in a continual relation and continual learning. But this is why presuppositionalism is so dangerous, because it removes the incentive to engage in a life of real learning other than the axioms. Let me put it this way. Maps create the incentive, and forgive me for moving so much between maps, presuppositionalism, internally consistent systems. They're all similar to me. But the issue to that is you're placing real knowledge in the terms of maintaining consistency, not in an act of relating to phenomenon that appear to you in the encounter, right? So you're saying, well, we can't get to the things in themselves, so let's just create a coherent mental system where there's no internal inconsistency, because we can't know the things in themselves, but we can know our systems. Let me put it this way. If we can't know the things in themselves, we can know if our systems are consistent, though. So let's focus on the consistency of our systems. That's what people do, right? This is a major mistake because it encloses and it treats it as if things cannot give you real knowledge. Whatever knowledge they give you is suspect, and it's not really there, right? This is a massive mistake because you know that you don't know the entirety of the thing. That's real knowledge. And that just means you need to relate to it as an unfolding process, which means you need to humbly attend to it. Humbly freaking attend to it. Like, I love the book. There's a long truce. He says, we're in a lot of trouble in pluralism because we're telling everyone to be tolerant. And you say, whoa, what's the problem with tolerance? He's like, well, tolerance is, to make a long argument short, tolerance is going to create presuppositionalism. That's what's going to happen. What you want is humility. Humility is when you look at the other and say, I disagree with you, but I think there's something to learn. Because that's what you did with your advisor, right? You could have gone and tolerated him. Instead, you said, no, I'm going to humble myself and enter into this relationship with humility. The problem with presuppositionalism is it destroys humility. It replaces it with tolerance, basically. And tolerance is a language of violence and a language of pride. I know everything. I have the true presuppositions. We don't need the alternative. Humility, well, it's just what you were saying on empiricism. If you take seriously that which is before you, then there's humility. And it's very dangerous when you don't have humble epistemologies. And what ends up happening is Christianity, and I think you're also right. Before I keep talking, I will give it to you for any thoughts on anything, is that a lot of Christians think it's humble to say that all we can know is the Bible. There's a certain, well, it's humble to say all we can do is theology. It's a false humility. The most dangerous temptations seem ethical because it's like all we can know is the Bible. Well, um, what you are saying, therefore, is that people who don't know the Bible don't know anything. That's what would follow. If all we can know is the Bible,
Yes.
then the people who don't know the Bible know nothing. So you know everything there is to know. So you are like freaking God, basically. Like if all that can be known is the presuppositions of the Bible, the people who aren't Christian know zero, and you know what can be known, therefore you know everything that can be known. It's the supreme intellectual pride, actually. But it comes in the guise of a certain humility that is so dangerous. But let me pause and throw it to you, Joe.
Oof. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's like such a complete self-abasement in theory, but it results in this ironic pride of I've got the whole truth already. And, you know, I think it can make sense when you're like at the outset of learning the doctrines of your faith. But, 4 years later, you're like, wow, kind of learned it because seminary is very comprehensive. And, you don't learn literally every jot and tittle of the Greek or whatever, but, you have so much access to it that you're just like, if this is all there is, then I am now the expert and I shall go out into the world and everyone shall be dumber than me. And that's it, you know? Yeah, your conception of like continued learning would just be so limited. It would be like filling in a couple little corners at the edge. I lost the other trains of thought. Let's see.
Well, I was just saying that the idea of things in themselves is like an ethical orientation. Like it's,
Mm.
this is where ethics and epistemology go on because, if it is unknown, that's an orientation by which to relate to it. And that brings a humility. And if you bring that to otherness outside of your system, then that also kind of has a humble status. So that was something else I was mentioning.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there was a piece I wanted to pick up on too about fallibility.
Mm.
So there's a book I'd highly recommend called Sources of Knowledge by a German analytic philosopher, Andrea Kern. And in it, she's kind of in the U Chicago like philosophy world, basically. She basically she argues this point about fallibility. Like so many modern philosophers under the influence of Descartes think that fallibility attaches to every exercise of our capacities.
Mm.
Every single thing I attempt to know, I just could be wrong. Like it could all be blown apart. There's an evil demon, blah, 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 blah. And so what we need to do is start from the infallible. Okay, so if you're Descartes, that's, a few propositions of reason or logic and a little bit of speculative a priori theology. And then we can start build out to there. Well, God wouldn't deceive us, right? Okay, now let's try to get some knowledge of the external world. You're trying to kind of climb out of this little hole you started from. The Bible plays the same exact function for modern evangelical Christians. It is the salvation from Cartesian skepticism.
Mm.
Because without the Bible, you know nothing, as you
Yeah.
said. And so, God came to save us from skepticism. He gave us some propositions so that we could know and deduce everything from them. But Andrea Kern argues, following John McDowell and others in this kind of school, that like fallibility, it's it doesn't apply to every exercise of our capacity. Like that's not the locus of it. Fallibility is about a capacity. And so, for example, a basketball player has the capacity to shoot free throws. This, even though they might have a 50% free throw percentage or a 3-point shooting percentage. You know, like fallibility does not undermine like you have a capacity. Well, if it's a capacity for knowledge and you say, well, it sometimes errs, well, the skeptical route is usually to infer, therefore knowledge is impossible. Knowledge requires certainty. It requires 100%. And what you've got is basically you've imported this idea of kind of Zeus the basketball player who swishes every single time. And you're like, that's not what a human fallible finite capacity is. A finite capacity is never 100%. And that's not exactly the same metaphor as the like, we're always in process, but I do think it's related because let's say if we don't believe that we start from something infallible, well, then it's fallible all the way down. But that doesn't have to lead to skepticism. It only leads to skepticism, turtles all the way down, if you're still committed to the idea that you have to have certainty.
Right.
Whereas if you reject that and say, you know, confidence in fallible capacities is good enough, which I think is, that's all a human can do.
Yeah.
Now, some of us shouldn't have confidence, and we need to build up our capacity in order to have such confidence, but human beings aren't incapable of everything. And that's where theologically you get this hyper-Calvinism, self-abasement, total depravity. Human beings' capacities have been just totally obliterated through the fall of man. And that's just extreme.
Yeah.
Like, we are fallible. We were fallible before the fall. We're fallible in new ways after the fall. Like, we're in, and we need to reconcile ourselves to that. Like, we're only human, and that's okay. There's a glory to being human, and there's, you know, there's a dose of humility that it requires of us because we just can't get everything right. But those are, yeah, some of the reflections.
I think it's so important. Well, what do you say? Wounded but not destroyed. Notion of the fall as a
Yes.
certain wounded but not destroyed. This is so important. Well, we only need certainty if the world isn't giving us support, right? Like if the world is actually giving us support and there's common ground and there's real knowledge, you don't really need certainty. Certainty is actually there's a weird way in which certainty is kind of the goal of making creation obsolete. Because if I have certainty, I don't need anything outside of myself, right? So there's actually a destruction of creation, a certain removal of creation in certainty.
Yeah.
Which, you know, that's of course, if, hey, everything is fallen, who cares if you destroy it? In fact, it will be the second coming. There's almost that, maybe that's kind of subconsciously playing that idea of the world burns, then salvation shows up. So once we get certainty and we don't need the world, well, then let it burn because there's nothing lost, right? And it does seem like that is what practically actually occurs when people are obsessed with certainty and presuppositions. They become less concerned about global affairs, economic issues, political issues. They are less concerned on these matters that might have the world burn. So it's hard for me not. I often think the fruit of care about certainty, which can happen in atheism, Christianity, in all different forms, conservatism, etc., the fruit of the quest for certainty is the death of creation. It's the death of the world because the world doesn't matter. You don't need its support. In fact, you're trying to do the world for yourself without the world, thus without relation, because certainty is anti-relation as well, right? If you have certainty, I don't need to relate to anything. It's self-move. It's self-contained, right? So it's anti-relational, which then, of course, if God is Trinity and relational, then this would be not in the image and likeness of God, which should be concerning. That's major problems there. What you were saying also about fallibility. Fallibility is only a problem if you can't recognize you are fallible. If you recognize you are fallible, fallibility is evidence of adjustment. You just adjust. I missed the free flow, so I adjust. The problem, so one of my overarching arguments for like a lot is that a lot of our misunderstandings in ontology, epistemology, pick your field, is that we make space over time primary. We're trying to define terms spatially and we leave out time. I also don't think, I think time, to say giant things I cannot prove. I basically think reality is time space more than space time. I think temporality is in a way more real than space, and that space is a manifestation of time. I do not think time is basically an illusion and that there's a block universe. Now, this is gigantuous, and I would have to explain all of this. But if time is actually reality, and that does not mean that there is no space. It just means that space is an unfolding, which is of course what we observe. Space is always unfolding. Reality is an unfolding process. Well, fallibility is simply the movement of time toward its end, right? It's only a problem if you miss it, is if space is reality. So you missed it in space, you got it wrong in space. Space is reality, therefore it's always wrong, because what happens in space is the constant. Space is the constant. But if time is the constant, as long as time moves toward the correct, as long as eventually you make the free throw, well, then you fulfilled it. Then you did it, right? Fallibility is only a death, like a death argument, if space is primary to time, right? But if time is primary, fallibility is simply the working out of how to align with the end, right? Which is a creative process. Would we say, hey, your first draft of The Sound and the Fury was terrible, Faulkner, therefore The Sound and the Fury is always terrible? No one would say that. We all know that creative activities have drafts and revisions and reworking, chiseling it into its finest form, of which is then apprehended when it's arrived. So process and apprehension go together. And of course, there is this question of what is this mysterious capacity of apprehension that Plato seems to allude to in Meno, and that many this ability to recognize, to remember this very critical capacity that's very important. But anyway, the creative act, we all know that the fact that the music makes mistake or that it changes does not mean Beethoven's Ninth will always be bad. You rework it, right? Because we understand what we understand creativity is a process, right? What if everything is just like that? What if everything is just the same, right? And you're therefore in the free fallibility is just the revision process. And then you could also make the argument, what if there are creative possibilities that will only be realized if reality is revisional in this way? If it was one to one, what if reality was such that if it was one to one, there was never mistakes, then there are creative possibilities that would never be realized. Well, then a world that is revisionary is more creative and more wonderful and more creative than a world that doesn't have revisionary. It would also, the world that doesn't have revisionary would probably be meaningless. We probably wouldn't care about it. It's precisely the ability to miss that makes us care. Error creates care, right? So fallibility is simply the blossoming of time into love and creatively unfolding in new possibilities. So to me, a lot of the epistemological concerns about certainty, fallibility, are treating space as more real than time. You're treating like this, space is more real than time. But if time is actually the prime background by which we should ask epistemologies, well, fallibility is just revision. It's just process. It's just things converging, coming to align with. And also fallibility, well, if we weren't fallible, we wouldn't be open to the other. Like, how could you be open to the other if you couldn't make mistakes, right? Like, the other is wrong. If you couldn't make mistakes, the other is wrong. End of story. There's nothing to be talked about. They do need to be converted. Presuppositionalism is true, actually.
Yes.
So wrongness is precisely the possibility of the other having value. If the other, if you're not wrong, the other has no value. They need to be corrected. So fallibility resists totalitarianism, I suppose. There's more to be said. But let me give it to you, Joel.
Yeah, on temporality and then the political, maybe. I think the temporal part that I've considered is the accumulation of wisdom as like a lifelong process.
Absolutely.
And that's very different from like the attainment of the right answers as quickly as possible to then propound. And so when I was talking about being a Christian humanist, what starts to come out, I mean, in the process of writing it, I start to feel like, who am I to say this? Like, I don't know my classics nearly well enough. I have my own smattering of like modern extra theological disciplines and, you know, but it's much more of a way of being.
Yeah.
Like and it includes this openness to further growth because it's an open system. Like, you know, in a decade, I could be reading about other areas I've never studied before to this point. I could be more up on economics or architecture or whatever it is. These days, I'm trying to take in like psychology and politics and like add those to my theology philosophy brew. But you know, it can always be increasing and growing. Um, and yeah, if the truth is the way the world is, which is ongoing and changing and developing, then or I think about some of the philosophies like embodied coping, Heideggerian, like actually that's what we're trying to do. And that's what I'm growing in more that like Christianity, a large part of it is like stoicism about coping with the troubles of life.
Mm.
Um, and you know, if it's not that, you know, that's a knock against it. Uh, so that's one piece. And then with the kind of political dimension, I think you're right to keep mentioning like the kind of violent aspect. You know, there's not a perfect alignment between people's theological epistemology and their politics, but there's a major movement from within presuppositionalism toward theonomy and then Christian nationalism,
Yeah.
all this stuff. Um, but it, it it's obviously the same. There's a closeness between the kind of evangelistic technique and the politics.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
non-Christian Americans have been trying to tell us this for decades, which is you're forcing your religion on me. And I think you have to realize that the same thing can happen in an impromptu conversation as happens on a political level, where the other person gets the sense that you don't think anything I say has any value. I know nothing, and you just want me to hop on the ship uh, to leave this dying world. And that's not a relationship people want to be in. It's a very negative experience for them. So, like another piece that's led me in this direction from a while ago was John Rawls' conception of public reason.
Mm.
It's at least one part of Rawls' liberalism that I am fully on board with,
Right. Yeah.
which is like the as you've been saying about democracy, like the reasons we give one another for policies need to be epistemically accessible to others. Like if a Muslim neighbor just cites a hadith and says this is the way it's got to be, I'm like, why? Can you give me some like sociological evidence that that's
Yeah.
like a good policy, that that works out? Can you give me like, if we really want to go there, can you give me proof that Muhammad was a prophet and so we
Sure.
should take everything? It's like you got to give me some reasons, and that can take different forms. Like from the Christian angle, it can be, I think, more on the progressive side. What you often find is progressives, Christian and non-Christian, actually agree with that side of Christian morality, turn the other cheek, such things. Like there's a lot of common ground in that direction. The conservative things you tend to have a bit more conflict with, like, say, secular liberal or progressivism. But there you see a willingness from at least conservative intellectuals to do the sociology and test things empirically and make a case in terms that are broadly accessible.
Right.
And basically, what I'm advocating is that Christians do one of those two at least, if
Yeah.
not the, you know, something in the middle or some mashup of the whole, where we can appeal to common moral principles all people accept, partly by not putting them in Christianese. Like if
Right.
you appeal to the golden rule, like you don't lose Americans. They're all listening.
Yeah.
They're all open and amenable to that. If you argue for something more controversial, like restrictions on access to pornography, Well, if you want to make a compelling case to your fellow Americans, you should probably do some psychology
Yeah.
and sociology surrounding that. And you're not through that process going to get to like a full puritanical restriction of everything, but you are going to get to um, there are downsides. Like almost everybody recognizes that the digital form of whatever human desire is always more addictive and kind of a distraction from the real thing. And that's a broadly compelling case. You're moving up to the bar of public reason. I think there are a lot of Christian doctrines that can operate that way. One that I've been meditating on, and I do think is an important part of Christian humanism, is the idea of the effects of the fall, that we're in kind of a post-lapsarian state. Okay, you can secularize this really easily. Call it the tragic conditions of existence, with a tragic sense of life, as existentialist philosophers have had it. Like, or the constrained view of human nature, and or stoicism of like life is suffering. There's all sorts of different ways to get at the idea that we are very limited and life is largely suffering. And this throws a wrench in some utopian schemes and different things like this, where that can be put in non-dogmatic ways or non-partisan or parochial ways. And I think, you've been involved with artistic creation and stuff like that's so much of what artists want to spell out, whether they're Christian or not, is kind of express the misery of our condition
Yes.
and then kind of the goodness that shows through it. Well, there you go. In the creation, fall, redemption schema, that's creation and fall.
Yeah.
Both of those completely accessible.
Yes.
On the redemption side, there's actually some that people are sympathetic to, like that life requires you to take up your cross and sacrifice certain things, or turning of the other cheek, which goes against the sort of natural human way of revenge. So there's a lot of common ground. There's a lot of way for people from a particular perspective or even a particular religious perspective to meet the bar of public reason. And that involves them now in relating to other people, both on an interpersonal level and a political level, in a much more constructive, relational kind of way. It's non-threatening, it's productive, it's neighborly, it's friendly.
I, I strongly agree. This is getting, I think, into some really important stuff. And I know you, alas, I know we both have restrictions in about 20 minutes, so forgive. But I will milk every one of those minutes, dang it. So, there are
Good.
a few things. What you were just saying about the tragic sense of life, 1000%. And using these sort of things as common ground. Sometimes I think, funny enough, the idea of total depravity, which is taken this idea that the fall creates a total depravity actually removes the potential of using the fall for redemptive purposes. Because if it's totally depraved, we can't
Yeah.
relate to other people. But if the fall only wounds us, then we can actually use it as a basis to relate with others, right? So there's a funny way in which the total depravity that's trying to really like emphasize the fall actually removes the potential of having it be a commonality with people, which then makes it to where everyone can see themselves as fallen. So this is my point. Total depravity decreases the probability that people see themselves as fallen who are not Christian. And that actually ironically limits the impact of the fall on people because then they don't refer to it. They don't talk about the tragic sin. They say, well, it's just my opinion, right? So there's a weird way, I'd have to write this out but I think about this a lot, where doctrines of total depravity actually limit the fall in their very emphasis because then only Christians can see themselves in it. Whereas actually, I think when you look at like the genius of someone like a Zizek, in his idea of the Christian atheism, is actually saying, no, there's something about the fall, there's something about the crucifixion that the atheist has to go through, or else they get the big other, etc., so forth. Who knows how much more of that kind of thinking may you have seen if there wasn't too much of this emphasis on total depravity, right? So there are certain ironies that come up all over the place. The other thing you were saying about,
Can I jump in on that one?
please, please.
Just to follow up while we're on that, like that's why I wrote recently about Zwingli, one of the first reformers before Calvin, and Calvin and Augustine usually end up with the blame for the really harsh doctrine of sin, whether it's original sin or total depravity. But he said original sin is not sin but defect.
Yes.
And it was just it's very powerful. Like, to me, my wife's a Christian counselor, like that is the core of what counseling is about. And I think the same for like psychotherapy. And it's when you express the idea of human sin as like the way the philosopher Ellen de Botton does, which is there's something a bit wrong with all of us.
Mm-hmm.
It makes everybody chuckle and kind of lighten up and be like, yeah, we all kind of do things we don't really mean to do, and hurt other people's feelings and just do dumb stuff. And like there's ways to just make that really accessible. So I just wanted to
I
pen that in
strongly
there.
agree. And I think by Christians, well, a very I am of the opinion that the lack of, say, Christian humanism, this open Christianity, actually has contributed to that understanding of sin actually just being restricted to Christians because sin equals total depravity. So then only Christians who share the presuppositions think it. And then the common ground that could have been possible and hopefully is increasingly common where the average person says, there's something wrong with all of us. Oh, we have a common ground. We could have gotten that, I think, a lot sooner, but the doctrine of sin went in a totalizing direction that then only Christian presupposition would agree with. And so I think that's been an unintentional
Yes.
consequence of trying to really take sin seriously has actually limited its effectiveness as a doctrine to bring about resurrection. Because the whole point of sin is to point to Christ, right? We're not pointing to sin for sin's sake. The idea to talk about sin is to talk about redemption. So by talking about total depravity, I'm of the opinion that you limit the scope of the redemption that is possible. And that has been a very unfortunate irony. But of course, if that would be appropriate for sin. I think what you were saying about epistemologically accessible is a huge deal. If the arguments you are making or the points you are making are not epistemologically accessible, what are you doing? What are you doing? It has to be propaganda by definition. It has to be a violent speech act. It can't be a communal activity. Communal speech requires epistemological accessibility. I strongly agree with that. One of the things that my mind goes to, what is the incentive for presuppositionalism? Why? What was the incentive for it? Why? What was the appeal for it? Right? Now, obviously, you would say, well, modernity and the critiques of deconstruction, and you're trying to deal with nihilism and create, real knowledge and like of the impossibility of certainty. Okay, let's grant it. All well and good. But I'm always interested Karl Barth, which I think you can associate with some presuppositionalists, as much as I understand him, with the church dogmatics, etc., so forth. He's famous for being
Yep.
horrified when the German faculty all supported the war. And he goes out and he writes his epistles to the Romans, kind of terrified by this, right? And there seems to be a connection between avoiding various political, social traumas and presuppositionalism. And I'm not now. Correct me if I'm wrong. I can't recall even some like who I adore. When you started talking about Zwingli, I was like, my gosh, I really, really like him because I just think he's been forgotten. I know he's not forgotten, but I think he's really important, and he also complexifies things. But if I recall, I believe he does end up in war and violence and different things that shows a certain danger, right? There's something, and I'd just be
Hmm.
curious what you think about this, because this is what I think about. Um, it's almost as if what you're doing is there's this concern of if we don't limit Christianity to its presupposition, it's going to get involved in politics. It's going to get involved in economics and stuff. And it's going to have to face trade offs that lead to violence and war. And that's going to retrospectively stain Christianity. But if we lock Christianity within presuppositions, even if you go into government, you can clearly distinguish between the stuff you have to do in your job and your beliefs. And it almost kind of defends it. Because, well, yes, I made decisions to go to war, but that wasn't from the place of my Christian presuppositions. They were actually defended. It was simply the decision that was made. There's some sort of purity, some sort of keeping it away from getting involved in the politically messy, the socially messy, Well, obviously, it's tied to a corruption. We don't want to get it influenced by atheism. And what if people, that's a lot of it, right? We don't want people to not convert, to fall out of the faith. So let's create presupposition. They'll stay in the faith. But it also, just from the
Mhm.
history of a lot of the people that go in a presuppositional direction, it often also seems influenced by traumas of war or traumas of changes in cultures that you're trying to get away from. And then also, I can't help but feel, and this is all just live thinking. I'm just forcing you to listen to me because I'm just thinking it with you.
Oh, totally.
And I haven't written it out. The other thing that it does is it kind of makes you feel okay not to go into politics or to go into business or whatever. Because you say, well, I have a Christian worldview. Business and politics doesn't accept my presuppositions. I can't, therefore they're fallen. Therefore, it makes sense not to get involved in the world, to get
Hmm.
involved in institutions, because all that could happen is a risk to my presuppositional system. So then it's okay not to engage in those things. Now, I want to note the following. The irony, I think that might be there. The irony is that actually turns into Christian nationalism because you can't sustain that contradiction because you have this sort of internally consistent system that you are being impacted by the outside world. So what you have to do is make sure the entire government is Christian. You have to swoop in and have it all be part of your consistency. You have two options: not to participate in a government that's pluralistic because it will corrupt your presuppositions. And if it is by definition pluralistic, it's going to be wrong by definition. Or you have to make the government a theocracy, basically. You have no choice. It seems
Hmm.
as if, I have no idea, I'll just be curious. It seems as if that's going on as well. That presuppositionalism leaves you with basically two options regarding spheres of influence in society: non involvement or theocracy, a theocratic Hollywood, a
Yeah.
theocratic, that's a strong word,
Yeah.
government. It seems as if that's part of it. And so some thinkers who created presuppositionalism, I'm not saying they were in favor of a theocracy, but it unintentionally, in order to avoid getting involved in these things that lead to great violence and then it corrupts Christianity, you separate it, but that unintentionally creates the option of just almost a Benedict option kind of thing, although I don't want to
Hmm.
overly identify that, or the unintended consequences, the logic that had you separate would justify nationalism. It would justify totalizing. The same logic couldn't stop
Hmm.
someone who says, well, instead of being uninvolved, what if we just make everyone in government Christian? What if we just made everyone in spheres of influence Christian? And you don't have the logic in presuppositionalism to stop that. Like that seems to be the problem. Is like the logic that brought to more of the isolationism is the same logic that would justify a totalizing. Now, I'm obviously alluding to the map is indestructible and the problem of map proliferation and map totalitarianism, totalization, because they go together. But there's something about the trauma of politics, the trauma of society and war that seems to be in the background of presuppositional thought that ironically creates the condition of political trauma and violence in the form of the defense of those presuppositions. So there's an irony at play. Any reaction that could be entirely wrong, but it's something I think about a lot.
No, I think there's a lot there. Um, like to start with, like one feature is in the academic environment, there's kind of a loss of a place for the Christian perspective or theology as a discipline that's taking place around the turn of the 20th century. And so thinkers like the source of Van Til would be Abraham Kuyper, who was a prime
Right.
minister in the Netherlands and comes up with the whole Kuyperian thing, which is kind of Christian worldview and um, which had two sides. On the one hand, it was very vocation oriented, like Christians go do secular callings. He was political as a result, but it also had this flip side, which was we're going to create Christian schools. We're going to create a Christian political party. It's actually kind of a retreat from kind of publicity to um, perspectivalism. Uh,
Yes.
and those two sides kind of are the two sides you're talking about. Um, I think the best of Kuyper is a version of what you're advocating. I just think on the principle level, he was suggesting kind of the no common ground, like we got to start from the Christian perspective that logically led to Van Til's presuppositional perspective, and from there to the mid 20th century theonomists, maybe to some of today's Christian nationalists. Uh, I also think presuppositionalism, while it was technically distinct from like American fundamentalism, basically by the fact that the American fundamentalists were dispensationalists and didn't smoke or drink. Meanwhile, the presuppositionalists were Presbyterians who were not dispensationalists and both smoked and drank. But it still ended up being the same kind of retreatist thing. Like the American fundamentalism was not the religious right. American fundamentalism was utterly apolitical. It was
Hmm.
total retreat.
Yes,
We're
it was.
talking from the 20s to the 70s. Okay, around the 70s
Yes.
with Roe v. Wade, Francis Schaeffer, C. Everett Koop start getting Christians back into politics, and then, figures like Falwell and so on. That was new, but it had exactly the structure you're talking about, which was, whoops, the culture went totally the other wrong direction than we wanted while we had retreated for decades. Now we got to step in and kind of be a bit coercive and manipulative, even though no one likes us and we're a minority now. Well, that doesn't lead to something very effective. And it's like now even more people have left the faith. And so Christian politics is getting even more vociferous. Well, guys, you've got to be, the less people like your perspective and the fewer people hold it, the more persuasive you have to be instead of coercive.
Right.
But, the more you feel impelled to be coercive because you're like, I got to fight back. I'm in a defensive position. Um, but it's counterproductive because people feel more inclined to suppress you the more you look like a threat. But back to like how it's responsive to catastrophe. This is where I'm studying people like Machen, who really was like the first liberal modernist versus fundamentalist debate was in the Presbyterian Church, basically. And he was trying to defend Princeton Seminary as one of the last Ivy League Orthodox seminaries.
Right.
He ended up having to leave both the mainline Presbyterian Church and Princeton Seminary, founding his own church and seminary. I attended the seminary and was part of the church. So, but that's just very poignant because in his life, there was a retreat from, well, at first he was very insistent on, yeah, these new methods of scholarship and objective research are really important. I quoted him earlier in the conversation. Like, we've got to explore both sides of the issue. We can't just like not do critical scholarship, which is what a lot of Christians wanted to do, stick their heads in the sand. It's like, we've got to do that, if only to answer the other side, but also, to learn things ourselves through the kind of, I mean, World War I don't know how that played in, but then through his church and seminary controversies, he's pushed to a bit more of a Christian perspectival angle and gives a speech to like an association of Christian schools. It's like, yeah, we need some Christian schools. Well, the American public schools used to be the Christian schools.
Right.
Those were the Protestant schools. Okay, so now you see a retreat. It's the same thing that happened with Kuyper over in the Netherlands, a decade or a couple decades before. And presuppositionalism comes out of that exact combo. A Dutch guy influenced by Kuyper, Cornelius Van Til, shows up at Machen's new founded seminary. Now, I think that shows the dynamic, which is sort of the loss of participation in shared institutions. And therefore, and there's kind of a trauma of that, and therefore a retreat into, we've got to be safe, we got to have our more kind of self-enclosed thing. With Zwingli, I think it was a little It was similar. I saw a similar pattern of sort of, he was very traumatized by war. I mean, that's for sure. At first, that led him to be this Erasmian pacifist, humanist, um, but his own kind of military efforts, which ended up causing the end of his life, were from a hope of seeing the Christian Protestant Reformation spread more broadly and kind of a worry that it wasn't working out.
Right.
Um, and that kind of led to a radicalization or politicization. I don't exactly know how to analyze all that, but I don't think it casts aspersions on all of his hopes. I think it just shows like the risk of what I think we need, and you're kind of hinting at, which is Christian realism on a political level. Like we do actually need to engage, but not in a totalizing way.
No, magnificent. And I know we have 6 minutes left, and it makes me sad because this is so important. Well, there's something about being at risk of that kind of mistake that you see that seems necessary for the Christian to actually think. If like
Mm-hmm.
presuppositionalism removes that risk, but that's the problem. There's something about certain risks that seem to be necessarily present if we are to actually think at all and to, well, defend the human, actually, because the human is in the situation of these risks. And if the Christian, like the
Mm-hmm.
human, well, the fallen human is in a world of these risks. And if the Christian theologically positions themselves away from these risks, there's a certain way in which you're distancing yourself in the fall. You're not really owning the fall. And maybe the reason you distance yourself is in the name of taking total depravity seriously or whatever, but actually you're kind of removing yourself from the fall as if you're not totally depraved because you can be outside of these tensions that are very difficult to think,
Yes.
right? So there's something I think about there where retreats, methods of retreat, actually are pulling you out of the depths of the fall. Because the depths of the fall are these
Mm.
seemingly insurmountable political tensions or risks or different things. So there's an irony there. And yeah, the point seems to be like the logic of retreat. So I do think there's a loss of shared institutions or a sense of a loss of the culture or a loss of different things, and the power went out for mysterious reasons. But oh, there it goes, it's back. This is cool. I tell you what. So there's kind of loss of that then leads to a logic of retreat.
Mm-hmm.
But the logic that led to the retreat also can give you is the same logic that would justify a takeover. That's the problem.
Yes.
Is presuppositionalism
Mm-hmm.
leads to retreat or takeover. Like, and you can't, if you're a presuppositionalist, you can't say that one political strategy is necessarily worse than the other. And I think presuppositionalism actually gets caught oscillating between retreat or takeover. And if we don't want to do that, we need to think theology differently. The last thing I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, this idea, like it's just very interesting on this idea of sharing Christian presuppositions. We have to start with, like you're right, like we have to educate to make sure that people start with Christian presuppositions. Um, there's an interesting thing which no conversion starts with pre-Christian presuppositions, right? No one converts with presupposition, but they come into real knowledge, right? Like they move in. That would be the claim of the presuppositionalist,
Yeah.
right? If somebody converts, they come into the presuppositions. But how did they
Yeah.
have the knowledge to make that conversion? And if you say it was the Holy Spirit, but here's the issue: the Holy Spirit is not a presupposition, but an experience, right? Wouldn't it be a kind of
Yeah.
experience? So you're saying an experience is what pulls you into the presuppositions, not the presupposition that comes first, right? So if there are certain kinds of experiences that can lead to conversion, then it is not actually presuppositions that are needed for real knowledge. There are kinds of experience that can actually lead to real knowledge, right? So then the question is, what is the Holy Spirit limited to? Is the Spirit limited to me telling you to believe in Christianity in a debate? Because history seems to be full of a whole lot of people being converted by sights of beauty, by, falling off a horse and seeing Jesus, like dreams. Like history is full to the brim of people being converted by visions and dreams and experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? If people can be converted by experiences, then experience can give you real knowledge outside of the presuppositions, right? Because so therefore you don't have to make sure the kids start with Christian presuppositions and start with a Christian education. You need to make sure they're open to the Holy Spirit. That's what you need to do. What we need to do is make people open to the Holy Spirit, quote unquote, not make sure they have the presuppositions. How do you make people open to the Holy Spirit? Well, I think beauty, shining, showing, and modeling a different way of life, not telling them to convert to but showing. The Christian should create experiences that open people up to different kinds of experiences that then move them into different ways of thinking. So as you're saying, empiricism is important, and I will stop and give you the last words as we have about 1 minute, is that the presuppositionalist seems to say the Holy Spirit converts people, then you are saying experience converts people. Well, then the Christian should be in the business of creating experiences. Not defending presuppositions, but creating experiences. And those experiences lend themselves in the direction of increasing the probability people are open to the Holy Spirit. I will stop there and say your work is really important. So Joel, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's they have their way around it by removing all justificatory force from the Holy Spirit. Like, we're completely unaware of the justificatory force of that thing. But yeah, at the end of the day, you're like, well, if it's just a circle of beliefs, like, people do pop into that circle somehow.
Yeah.
They must, I would conclude, be seeing something.
Yeah.
There must be some experience or reason that has brought them to that point. Like, it's not impossible. The idea is that you're only going to get Christian conclusions if you start from Christian presuppositions, but the entire history of humanity proves otherwise.
Yeah.
Some people who do not start from Christian presuppositions end up at Christian conclusions. So, I mean, what I'm starting to come to, I'm going to write this down at some point, is that I'm not a Christian presuppositionalist, but a Christian conclusionist. I think that's what everybody should be for whatever your worldview is. Like, if you're a Marxist, don't tell me you start from Marxist presuppositions, because that just means, like, what's underneath your presuppositions? Are they correct?
Yeah.
Say you're a Marxist conclusionist. Like,
I like
the
that.
conclusion I've come to, I think that's always more compelling.
Yeah.
Is when someone says, I didn't start there, but the conclusion I've come to through considering everything and through some life experiences that were very powerful led me to the following conclusion. Those are the people I actually trust, because they didn't have, ulterior motives to end up where they ended up. And I think that's just the proof that they were thinking, because reality surprised them, and they're telling you what reality surprised them with.
That's really good. I'm going to use that and say Joel Carini, ladies and gentlemen, the natural theologian, conclusionist, Christian conclusionist. That is fantastic. Joel, I have enjoyed every minute of it, and I really enjoyed it, and your work matters, and thank you for doing it, and thank you for your time, and I really always look forward to the chance to speak with you. So thank you so much, Joel. It was a complete delight.
Thank you, Daniel. I always enjoy speaking with you, and I'm always greatly encouraged by it. So thanks for your work.
Well, thank you. Thank you for yours, Joel, and it means a lot. Best to you, and have a great day, sir. All the best. All the best.